Good evening. First of all, a deep, big thank you to JCC and Barbara Lane for having us here today. Göran was supposed to, thank you. I have to remind you, Barbara, that on the 4th of December, that's our name's day, Barbro and Barbara. So congratulations in advance. Göran Rosenberg was supposed to have come here in April, and he had to leave very hurriedly from the East Coast. So this is, in a sense, a repeat show. It isn't, but we almost had the dress rehearsal. Tonight is the real event, Göran. Göran Rosenberg is in Sweden, I would say, world famous. And he is an icon on radio and television. He appears in the daily newspapers very often with essays, articles, critics. He also travels around a lot in conjunction with his new book, the one he's going to present tonight. And that is A Brief Stop on the Way from Auschwitz. It's a very compelling story, and you have to do a lot of soul searching, and I get very choked up when I even think about what the book is all about, but he will tell you more. It is my deep, deep pleasure to welcome Göran Rosenberg here to talk about the search of his childhood and his father.
Well, I also have to say a word of gratitude to Barbara Osher that made it possible for me to resume my tour. I was actually on my way to the plane, literally, when I had to break off, and the event that was supposed to take place here had to be cancelled. And I thought that was it. I mean, you don't go back for a book that is half a year old. You know, books are like vegetables. Has to be consumed fresh, it's supposed. But I think this book has had a certain lasting value, obviously, at least in the eyes of Barbara, and obviously in the eyes of you who have come here to listen, although the book has been out for a while. It has also been a great success, I have to say, in Sweden, and it has been translated to many languages, and I'm getting used to that. But I have to say that it came almost as a shock to me that this book at all became a bestseller. I don't even, that it at all sold any larger number of copies, because I have written books before and they have sold well. But this was my private little book. This was a book I wrote for myself, in a way that I think no other book that I had written was. It was the book perhaps that I had in mind to write much longer than anything else. Like a story the story that is yours, and you somehow ponder what to do with it, the story in your life that you want to do something with. So even before I knew I could write a book, and even long before I knew that I had material to write this book, this was the story I was carrying. And in hindsight, I would say all other books that I have written, and there are a few, they are exercises in trying to figure out how to write this book. And proof of that is, you cannot check this because the books are not in English, they are in some other languages. But they all begin at that same little small place, actually the Rowan Barry Avenue in a part of a very small town in Sweden called Södertälje. It is a world-famous town, I have to say, because it makes the famous Scania trucks, and it makes some, still was the place where the pharmaceutical company Astra, now AstraZeneca, was founded, and there are a few other things there. And of course, it's the birth city of Björn Borg. And And now it actually is the birth city of myself too. So this book is an attempt to write about my father, or rather it's an attempt to recreate my father and to resurrect him. Having said that, you will now deduce that he is no longer with me. That's true. He has actually not been with me since I was 12 years old. I will not say how this book actually ends, but it ends in 1960. So this is the time when I have my father as a young child. So my idea was to find out, not who he was, but I wanted to find out, or find him rather, as I found him as a child. I wanted to see him again as a child, because I wanted to make him come alive again. And the only way to do that was to become a child again, to write this book as a child. And if there is a label on this book, it has been labeled many things, but the label I would put on it is a childhood memoir. It's a childhood memoir. It's a non-fiction book. It has won literary prizes, and it is literature. But I have to emphasize that this is not a novel, although people have somehow called it a novel. And the reason I emphasize that it is a non-fiction book is that I was so adamant, and that whatever I brought out about my father would not be perceived as something that I had invented. Now, having said that, this is a childhood memoir. What do we know about childhood memories? Well, I think we can safely say that we know that they are not always accurate. Sometimes we remember things that perhaps did not even happen. We heard about them later. This is an excavation of childhood memory in order to find out about this man, my father. And I have done as much as I can to keep the promise to myself that I should not invent anything in this book. Having said that, there's a lot of room for literature, which means imagining things, but with that promise to myself that not consciously make up anything about my father, which means he doesn't speak in this book, he doesn't think in this book, I am not reading his thoughts. The words that are his in this book, they are his words from letters that I was later given. And those who will read this book, and I hope you will do it, because I cannot do justice actually to this by talking about it, will find out that there is in this book also a love story between a man and a woman, my father and my mother. Now, the story of the book is simple. My father, a man, comes to Sweden in the summer of 1945 as a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. He comes through the ghetto of Lodz or Łódź to Auschwitz, and from Auschwitz to the slave labor camps in Germany, and in miraculous ways, as always in these cases, he survives until May the 2nd, when he's liberated by the 82nd Airborne Division in a place called Webelin. And he's brought by the Swedish Red Cross in the summer of 1945 to Sweden, together with 30,000 survivors of the camps, the German camps. In the summer of 1945, Sweden has decided to temporarily receive 30,000, approximately, from the camps at the request of the Allies. They asked Sweden to do this. 10,000 of those were Jews. They were given a temporarily residence in order to recuperate, of course, and to find a stay before they went some other place or went back to where they came. So they were called transit migrants or repatriandi and other things. My father was among these. My mother, whom I will speak about later, knew my father in the ghetto. They were teenage lovers. They were deported together in August of 1944 to Auschwitz and then separated on the platform. and most of the families went to the gas chambers, but my father and a brother and my mother and two sisters were sorted out for further transport, it turned out. My mother was survived in a different way and was liberated by the Red Army in Poland, and my father came to Sweden. Now, the story is starts, or as I hoped started, when I get to see this man as a child. When he arrives at this small place where I grew up, where I was born and where I grew up. And the idea was that as a child, I would get to know him and get to know his world. In that sense, of course, this book is a failure that I think every book must be when a child tries to see their parents as children. Because as children, we don't see our parents. We are not interested in them. We think their grown-up world is uninteresting, utterly boring, actually. We are very self-centered. Children are self-centered animals. They want to conquer the world for themselves. They want to make the world their own. This is an exciting time for a human being to see the world for the first time, to put their first words on everything, to see everything with those non-tired eyes that you normally achieve when you grow older and everything is become, usual. So to me, to the child, this is a book. The world of the child is a world of light, of excitement, of discovery. And in this little childhood world, there is no room really to see the father, and specifically not to see what you cannot see, and that is what he's carrying with him. I thought that when I would start to write this book, I would remember things, because of course I knew where he came from as a grown-up. It's a grown-up person who have written this book. That's for sure, but I've done my best to assume the eyes of a child. And you couldn't see those things. So there are two explorations in this book. One is the childhood exploration of childhood memories, and I think that's what I wanted to do in the book, and I think it permeates the book, and it also gives it its tone. It's a child talking to his father. But the other one is a very, very traditional exploration or investigation or research as a writer, as a journalist, as an historian, as whatever, to find out what was it I didn't see. What was it there that I couldn't see as a child, that I could sense? Childhood memories are not intellectual memories. They are not stories, verbal stories, really. Then they are not childhood memories. Childhood memories are sensitory memories. You remember with your body. You remember events. You remember colors. You remember voices. And from these events that I have stored in my body, there are stories evolving in this book. And some of those stories will hint at what it was that my father had been through, but not that I could intellectually or any other way understand as a child. So they remain there as a sort of dark shadows or memories or senses of something horrible, something out there. And I want to read you from those passages, but there are a few of those events in the book that I recall. But the main conclusion from writing this book is, as I say, these two worlds of ours were at that time incompatible. Most children have something common in with their parents. Of course, we all have, but more than I had. They have a past in common with their parents. The past of the parents is also the past of the children. They have grandfathers, grandmothers, they have places, they have memories, they have stories, they have pictures, whatever. So that is something that binds a child together with their parents normally. I didn't have that. There was nothing like that in my childhood. There were no pictures, there was no stories, there were no memories, there were no people, of course, no grandmothers and grandfathers. So in one sense, my childhood was a childhood of without a history. And it was not that only that I was without that history, but my father was without it too. When I say here my father, I will also say my mother, but I will also say that this book, for many reasons, was a book about my father. My mother is here, but it is a book for reasons of mine, a book about him. So that word, that past, that history was not there for him either. This is my deep conviction that the memories of his own childhood, of his own first world, were suppressed. They were not. They were not accessible to him. Not only that he didn't tell me, I don't think he could bear to tell himself about it. So to us, to me and the child, this place has two different, completely different significances. To him, it's a place where he has to start his life anew without really a past, without really having that word remaining, the word of childhood. That to me, that this was it. This was the place. So I will read you a passage which I think will give you a little sense of that gap between us that I think also permeates the book. And it is when I describe our move then to this little house in this Rowan Barry Avenue. This is it. This is the place. Now, I'll start a bit earlier. It's very difficult in the English to find exactly the places where I'm used to read, but I will start a bit. We moved to the house I actually remember a year or two later, which means I was born in a house which I don't remember. We moved to the house I actually remember a year or two later. The documents say one thing and the aging memory another, but it doesn't matter. This is where it all begins, in the building below the railroad station, where the young man who will be my father alighted from the train on an early August evening in 1947, and which you can see right beneath the window on the left-hand side of the coach if you arrive by train from the north across the bridge. All these things have already been elaborated, the places in this chapter, but this is it. This is the place. This is where my world assumes its first colors, lights, smells, sounds, voices, gestures, names, and words. I'm not sure how far back a human being can remember. Some people say they have memories going back to their second year, but my first memories are of snow and cold, and therefore probably date from somewhat later, since I was born in October. But one thing I'm certain of is that even before the point where my memories of that first word of mine begin, it had already set its stamp on so much that even things I can no longer remember are not forgotten either. This is the place that will continue to form me even when I'm convinced that I've formed myself. That's the difference between them and me. They have encountered the world for the first time in an entirely different place and carry with them an entirely different world. And for them, so much has already started and already ended, and it's still unclear whether anything can start afresh here, since a great deal of what they can't remember or don't want to remember, they cannot forget. For them, the colors and the shifting light and the smells and sounds and voices of this place will often remind them of something else, though they might not always know what it is. For them to be able somehow to make this place their own, they'll have to get to know it well enough and let it stamp them deeply enough so that sometimes it will be this place they're reminded of when they hear a freight train rattle past at night, or inhale the smell of fried herring in the stairwell, or walk under tall pines, or catch a whiff of tar and sea, or see rowan berries glowing in the fall, or look at their children. What quickly binds them to the place is the child, who happens to be me. I don't want to exaggerate my own importance in this context and could be wrong. But on a purely practical level, a child makes it harder to move on. Moving on with only a hat on your head and a suitcase in your hand is one thing. Moving on with a newborn child is another proposition entirely. For the sake of the child, a brief stop must be extended indefinitely, and big plans associated with the journey onward must be reduced to little plans associated with the place where they happen to be. A happenstance that the place confirms with a miracle. And the miracle is an apartment. Sweden, after the war, had a terrible shortage of housing. So that little apartment is the miracle, and that is where I grow up. In this flat, it's a one room with a kitchen. In this flat, the child takes up more space than the naked eye can see. Around the child, an expanding web of ambitions and plans. The little cardboard box of alphabet blocks, made and decorated by hand, is not just a toy, but also a project. And the perpetually changing letter combination that the child and the young man who is now his father lay out on the living floor room on those long Sunday afternoons form not only the words of a new language, but also the building blocks of a new world. The child shall make the place his own so that a new world will become possible for them as well, is the project that rapidly fills the small apartment with its invisible inventories of dreams and expectations. After all, what the new arrivals need is not a roof over their head, but a firm ground beneath their feet. And if the child can take root somewhere, perhaps they too, in time, will find a foothold. The child then is me, and the place I will make theirs by making it mine has its geographic center in a yellow 3-story apartment block with 2 entrances and 18 rental units just below platform 1 of the railroad road, where the big passenger trains make a brief stop on their way south. Even the expresses, even the night trains, even the trains to Copenhagen and Hamburg. From the kitchen and living room windows in the small first-floor apartment in the block nearest the forest, you can see people moving about in the railroad cars, and people being moved along by the railroad cars. And with every train, behind the reflections in the railroad car windows, a new world, mutely oblivious of its brief stop in the world that is to be mine. This then is as far as I get, I guess, in using my childhood memories for excavating this story. As I said, there is a lot of work of digging and research and investigation to do for me to find out who my father, what he came with to Sweden. Now, honestly, I did not know these things. This is the strange. When I was even 30 or even becoming 40, all those details were hazy, and I had no real clue. How did he come here? So this was, for me, such a journey as well. But there is a limit to this journey, and I have to emphasize this. Normally, you would start writing about a person going back to his childhood. And as I said, grandfathers, grandmothers, places, smells, this and that. But since that didn't exist for me, and I don't think it was able for him to have these things with him, it's too painful. So I have to decide to start my journey somewhere else. And I decide to start this, or his journeys rather, and my journey in his footsteps, at that point, which I believe is the point where the old world leaves him, turns its back to him, where the old world somehow is disappearing from his life. And these are these traumatic events that all the survivors, or most of the survivors, went through, where everything that they believed in, everything they had grown used to, everything they thought about human life and human relations were turned upside down. And there is such an event in the ghetto of Lodz. There are several such events. As you know, the ghettos were places where the Jews were concentrated, from Poland and then Germany and everywhere. And became then the places from which the transports went to the extermination camps. Now, people in the ghettos were not told that they were trains going to extermination camps. I mean, the whole language of the Nazi system was to not to tell anybody the truth. So it was all euphemisms about transports, and you have to go to some other place, and working camps, and so forth and so on. But there is a moment in the ghetto in Lodz in September 42, which I'm not going into. But if you read about it, and if you hear about it, if you see all the documents about it, and you think, have you been through that? There is something that is broken in you, and probably forever. Enough said of that with this short time I have, but this is, of course, very important to try to understand what my father carries with him when he comes, and why I say that this book is about surviving the survival. The fact that he survived is a miracle, as I said, but this is a common story. We have read all these books, and this is really not a book about the Holocaust. This is a book about a man after the Holocaust trying to go on with his life, continue to live, and not survive. But we have to know that the people who had been through this in one way or the other, in one capacity or the other, were deeply damaged. They were, first of all, if you had been into the Nazi system for the extermination of the Jews, you had been humiliated to a point which I don't think we can imagine. The Nazi program was about dehumanizing the Jews, taking away all human value in their own eyes too. Unfortunately, this is what happens. You demoralize, dehumanize a person, and you also make the person, and many of them, lost their sense of value. If you are treated as not having any value, your sense of value will be hurt, affected, killed even. In addition, all of these people who by miracle survived knew that they had survived by coincidence, and they could, and they start also feeling a sense of guilt of having been spared, while all the others had been killed. This is common. Why am I alive and these others are not? My brothers and sisters and fathers and everybody I know, they are dead. So in order to continue living after being through this, you have to overcome these enormous barriers and somehow try to justify to yourself why you're alive. I'm generalizing a bit, but this is from the story I'm telling in this book. This is a story about one man. But it's clear when I tell this story that this is what he is facing. This is a group of people that come to Sweden, all of them, with the same sense of loss, sense of being totally alone in the world in many ways. They are received in Sweden quite well in reception camps all over the country. My father comes together with his brother to one, and then to a second one, and then eventually he goes to a small place, a small city called Alingsås, and they start working. This is what happens in Sweden in 1945. People who were not wanted, who were feared actually, are suddenly needed as workforce. So this is the great integration machine starts working after the war, and many of the survivors immediately get into the economy and start working. But there is very little interest, and this is what surprised me when I started writing this book. I thought there would be immense amount of material about this short period in Swedish history in the summer of 45 and the fall of 1945 when these people came. And I was expecting enormous, huge stories in the newspapers about this. People should be curious about it. But I found very little, very little. For the most, I read a bit. It's better than but I express it better when I write it down. For the most part, the Swedish press doesn't write very much about the aliens' camps and the people who populate them. In community after community, Auschwitz temporarily moves in behind the local corpse store, but leaves little trace in public life. Only rarely do journalists take the opportunity to visit the camps and interview the people who inhabit them and provide an account of their experiences, and thereby also try to understand why some of them sometimes behave as they do. It's as if a curtain of silence has descended between the world the visitors bring with them and the world that surrounds them. Or a curtain of anxiety, perhaps, that the two worlds will prove incompatible, or at least will not readily tolerate meeting each other. I note this anxiety also in Alva Myrdal. She was a very famous Swedish personality at that time. In Alva Myrdal's otherwise enlightened view of the camps, anxiety that the darkness inside the residents will infect the enlightened society around them. The victims of brutality themselves become brutalized, she writes, and I quote, "When life is reduced to its bare minimum, primitive selfishness is the only natural response. Women whose reason should tell them that they will get enough food and that there will be food for the next meal and for the next day too, cannot believe it because of their old terror. They save every crumb left over from the table. They pick dandelion shoots and other things to eat. They collect the pig's potato peelings. They rake up every dry little pea that has fallen on the ground. They even continue to steal from the camp stores. The question is raised, what are we to do with such people? In two articles in June 1945, they are described as animals. The writer maintains that most of them survived thanks to those more or less animal qualities that Western society otherwise tries to keep in check: trickery, cunning, lying, obsequiousness, pilfering, and selfishness, combined with a certain brutal will to live. She is consequently concerned about who would eventually want to employ them. It won't be easy for them to adapt, and it won't be easy for their employers. The latter will presumably require more tireless understanding and generous humanity than the average employer can muster. So this was a transition period in Swedish history, and as I said, it changed. Sweden changed during this time, and among those feared not being able to stay or accommodate or being employed was my father, and another perhaps altogether 3,000 Jews stayed on in Sweden and became fathers and mothers of another generation of Swedes or Swedish Jews. And I was one of them. The story then is about the project, as I call it, this attempt to make a new life under these circumstances. And what I can say about the circumstances that in one way they were absolutely ideal. Sweden was spared from the war, the economy was booming, social welfare state was building, young children, like even if they were children of workers or immigrants or refugees or survivors, had the same chance to education as anybody else. And I guess I'm proof of that it worked in a fantastic way. So from a material, social point of view, I think this was a wonderful place to be rescued too. That is one part of the story. The other part that is perhaps more problematic, because as I said, a survivor as my father, he needed to, as they say nowadays in Sweden, be seen. He needed to be recognized, not only for who he was, but also for what he had been through, what he came with. They wanted to be understood in the sense that the world, the surrounding world, would know what had been done. And to them, but of course also what the world had been doing. But anyway, this is what he has to face when I grow up and I start to remembering the kind of life I'm witnessing. It's a life of ambition, of energy, of optimism, of joy, I have to say. Many people who have read the book say it's a sad book, but it's also a book about the will to life, the will to go on, the will to continue. And as I call it, it's in this book, I call it the project. My father had a project. I was part of that project, one might say. And one of the things he really wanted to do was to get out of the factory. The factory eventually became a prison to him. And the possibilities to advancement, even for an ambitious, intelligent, and very skillful person as he was very limited. And I think there, the old Sweden still remained. He was not expected to go beyond being a pipe fitter, as it were. And I will read a bit from that, if you allow me, a conclusion of that, a part where I describe his life in the factory. I call it a project, as you will have noticed, because that's how I perceive it much later, when I want to connect your early concern for the child's reading ability and your late night pouring over course books and your restless ambition to move ahead in a life that still surprises you every morning and which is built on survival and reunion in a configuration too miraculous to be allowed to stagnate or, God forbid, to come apart. Within the parameters of the project, the letter from the personnel department was an answer to one of his requests for having to be moved to another department and to learn a new profession. And he was denied. They were saying that within the foreseeable future, there is no place for you there. The letter from the person within the parameters of the project, the letter from the personnel department is no mere trifle, but no disaster either. The place offers other dreams to be fulfilled, such as a 2-room apartment on the other side of the Rowan Barry Avenue, or a black 1955 Volkswagen offered at an employee discount, or a factory-subsidized house of your own, expected to be built largely by yourself. So there it was. The cover of this book, people ask probably why there is a beetle on it. There is a black 1955 Volkswagen Beetle. We bought one of those, my father did. And I have always wondered, not always, but at that time I was of course happy. I was not very much interested in cars. I was not the car boy. But and I could really not see any use for the car. The factory was 10 minutes with a bicycle, and I walked to school, and we had nowhere to go with the car except going on car tours, as people did on Sundays, watching nature from the car, and then taking out their picnic table at a parking space and having their lunch, and cleaning the car. That was very important, cleaning the car. So it was. But my father bought that car because he had made an invention, and invented a luggage rack for the Volkswagen, an ingenious luggage rack. I don't know if you know, but Volkswagen, the Beetle, doesn't have a storage space of any value at all. So you have to put things in the back of the back seat. There was a little space in the back seat too. So he invented the Piccolo, which was, there's a picture of the Piccolo in the car too. This is his invention. And it's his invention alone. As I researched his story, he's so down alone with his lug wreckage. He writes, and I do remember, because as a child I had to help him Sundays put a leaflet that he had done for a sale leaflet or an ad under all the the wipers of all the Volkswagens that we could find in the street. And it was many, because it was the best-selling car in Sweden at that time. And it was a very, very, it's a wonderful little thing. And he wrote it himself. And it said that if you want to buy this, you could call us at home, this is our home number, at 8 o'clock in the evening. And it could be delivered at COD, cash on delivery, and so forth and so on. And it was severely tested by me and my friend Anders. We were jumping on it, and we knew it was safe to put some luggage on it. So these are so many of these signs of his extreme ambition to do something. And since time is running out, I can't perhaps tell you so much more about it, only that there is a somber ending to this in a way, because all of these things somehow don't succeed. There is always something that prevents him from taking off, as I would say. The horizon, his horizon, never really opens. And one can always, in hindsight, ponder whether this was because of his, his condition, the fact of him being a survivor with all the psychological pressure that was on him, or it was because it was a stranger in a foreign country, in a small town, where they really didn't appreciate or didn't understand or whatever who he was and what he wanted. I don't know, but this is what I try to record. Much later, I read that, I'm holding the yellowing leaflet in my hand, astonished by your energy and initiative. Where do you find the time to do all this? I don't remember anybody helping you. Yours is the only name on the leaflet. It is to you the customers are told to phone or write. You are the inventor, manufacturer, and salesman all in one. You are working 48 hours a week at the truck factory, and you are clearing a forest plot in Vibergen for that house he was supposed to build. And you are the father of 2 children in a tiny one-room apartment below the railroad station, and you design, make, and sell the piccolo. Much later, I can see how alone you are with your invention. There is no evidence of a partner or a financial backer. Much later, I'm surprised at how far you get with it alone. I don't know what causes the project to founder in the end, but I suspect it's lack of capital and contacts, and possibly, when I think about it, a lack of that kind of boldness that borders on foolhardiness. You are bold enough to invest, but not foolhardy enough to keep on once you realize the risks you're running. Or rather, once the fear of risking the life you have gets its claws into your ambitions to start a new life. At any event, this is how I much later feel impelled to interpret the momentary explosion of energy and activity and confidence, and the equally swift retreat to your starting point as an able and industrious fitter bending pipes at a truck factory. You simply cannot be allowed to fail, and when the demons of failure get their claws in you anyway, you lack the required boldness or foolhardiness to take up the fight. The piccolo fades away, leaving behind an embellished black Volkswagen Beetle, and Vibergen becomes a small 2-room apartment on the other side of the Rowanberry Avenue, where the kitchen window looks down on the outer harbor and some small villa gardens. There are apples ripe for swiping as the hot summer of 1955 turns into fall. One can say that the book as a whole turns into fall. I won't go too much into that. Let me end by reading a more essayistic or reflective part that perhaps summarizes a bit my take on the surviving the survival, if you allow me, and then I will end and will open up for your questions. Time to say something about the term survivor as applied to people in your situation. The term that slowly crystallizes out as all others are tested and found inadequate, making the central element of your situation the fact that you are still alive. People survive things all the time, of course. War, persecution, accidents, epidemics, without necessarily being termed survivors, except with specific reference to the event they have survived, and mainly as a mere statement of fact. people who survive go on living. They don't go on surviving. Surviving is normally not a continuous state, but a momentary one. I think the term survivor initially has the same significance, a statement of fact for people in your situation too. You have survived against all odds and must now go on living in one of the categories available to you. Refugees, transit migrants, repatriandi, displaced persons, Polish Jews, stateless individuals. Initially, it's also clear to the world what exactly it is you have survived and how implausible it is that you're still alive. At least there is no shortage of evidence or of pictures for those who can bear to look at them. The words are still unfamiliar and unreal and are sometimes prey to the confusion of languages. Gas chambers, death factories, extermination policy, final solution, annihilation. But those of you who have survived have no reason to doubt that the word knows what you have survived, that the word is shaken to its very foundations by the knowledge, and that the word afterward is no longer the same as the word before. It's impossible to think anything else. It's impossible to think you've all survived in order for the word to forget what it's just been through and to go on as if nothing has happened. There must be some point to the fact that you've survived, since the main point of the event you've survived was that none of you were supposed to survive, that you were all supposed to be annihilated without a trace, without leaving even a splinter of bone behind, still less a name on a death list or a death certificate. It's not that you're crying out for the word's attention and demanding its collective remembrance and recognition. On the contrary, your reticence about what you've been through is a matter of record. I think the world you survive into is populated by two categories of people: those who know and those who don't. Faced with people who know, there is not much that needs to be said. And faced with people who don't know, it's hard to say anything that doesn't risk being perceived as unreal or exaggerated or pathetic. Before long, you also discover that what you have to say risks being perceived as frightening and repugnant. In any case, the world soon stops listening, because it can't bear looking back either. Within a few years, the newsreels disappear from the cinemas, the testimonies from the newspapers, and the confusion of languages, the onerous kind, is spreading. The world looks forward without looking back, and you try to do the same as best you can. Did you know that long ago, survivors of war and disaster were sacrificed to the gods as scapegoats or were declared insane because no one wanted to hear what they had to say? Not being able to take the step from surviving to living, always having to live with your survival as the central element of your existence, is a kind of insanity, I suppose, even if it's not necessarily the survivors who are the insane. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll start here with a question.
Hi, I'm a child of survivors also. So is my husband, and we're Polish. I'm a Polish Jew. My question to you is, was there much of a community in Sweden of survivors? Did you participate in one as a child or your family?
Certainly there was. I mean, the survivors tried as much as they could to stick together. As I said, there were people whom they could be with, and not much had to be said. The problem was, of course, in my case, and in my father's case, we lived in a very small town, which successively became depopulated by Jews. Those who could left. In the beginning, I have to say, you couldn't leave. I mean, if you wanted to go to Stockholm or Gothenburg or Malmö, the three larger cities, you were not allowed to. Until 1953, as much as I could record it or found documents, it was stamped in their permit, that they were not allowed to do that. Then my parents became Swedish citizens in 1955, and I think it was then open. Perhaps it could have been possible earlier. I should say that the survivors needed a larger community, and they sought out a larger community. And in the small towns, and one would say that, so I think that was one of the problems with the place which I grew up and which is still my place, that it had so few survivors, had very little possibilities for that type of communion. And I think you are right. I think it was necessary for them to have it.
I just wondered, I don't know how old your father was in 1945.
He was born in 23, so you can make the... He was
Yes.
22.
He was 22. Well, have you read, you must have read some books before, I'm sure. Have you read...
No, I have never read any book before this
no,
one.
I meant concerning that issue. Have you read The Uncommon Friendship? And
No.
it's an American book, and it is about a Hungarian Jew and a German who become friends through the wife of the German, I think. He was a professor in Berkeley, and the Hungarian Jew was a lawyer for Safeway. And he lost everything. And then when they decided, the wife decided that they would go back, and first the German would go, and they would meet at a restaurant and all of that. And then he said, I'm not jealous, the Hungarian Jew said, I'm not jealous for anything, but I don't have any photographs or anything to show. And they all, it was that what you brought up before, that there was just nothing to relate to.
Yeah, you want me to comment, or?
Yeah.
No, but that's nice. No, I haven't read that book, I'm sorry, but there are so many interesting and really, every story is worth telling, I would say. And the more the better, I would say.
Question back here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your beautiful words, both written and spoken. I'm curious a little bit about language. I know sometimes when people come to a new country, they also have to learn new language. And I'm wondering if there was ever a language spoken by your parents that they may or may not have wanted you to understand, and whether that was a barrier, or whether later in life the sounds of that earlier language trigger a sense of connection. Just, would you comment on that?
Yeah, it's actually in the book as well. No, it's true. No, it's said that my first spoken words were Polish. In my home, Polish and Yiddish was spoken, but successively Swedish took over. I refused to respond, I think, to any Polish or anything else. I was, as I said, a very egocentric child. I wanted to blend in immediately, and I'm ashamed to say, a bit ashamed that I had parents who had an accent and who spoke foreign languages. My mother shouted through the windows when it was dinner. She shouted in Polish, and I didn't like that. Chodź do domu, and all things. So this is things that I can look, and I'm really quite aware of it when I write this book. I'm not the nice, compassionate child that I wish I were at that time. And whether they spoke things that I shouldn't overhear, I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did. But I'm not sure I was interested in listening, and even if I understood it. I am a very small child in the period that it goes up to the age of 12. So I have to excuse myself a little bit.
Question here.
How do you feel about the current migration into Sweden from the Middle East?
Ooh, big question. Big question. It's a new situation we have in Europe. It's a large-scale migration in a way that we haven't seen before, and it's also under new circumstances. So we are now grown-up welfare states. When my parents came, there was no reception committee, and there were no money, and there was no commitment really by the states. Actually, you had to provide for yourself immediately. I remember my mother was always a bit, saying, well, all these people coming now, they get everything, they don't have to work for it. And she was also, of course, all kind of prejudiced of that. But it's true, with the modern welfare state, there is a commitment in Europe to the people who flee, asylum seekers, and we have to live up to that. On the other hand, there is a limit to how much you can do. And I think now we are receiving people in the quantities that we cannot deal with the way we function as welfare states. In Turkey, you can come 1 million people and you put up tents and you have to, try to figure out how you're going to survive. But you cannot do that in Sweden or in Germany. So yes, we are facing an enormous challenge, and we have to figure out. In principle, of course, because of my history, but also I think because of who I am, I think we should have a very generous policy when it comes to people seeking protection. We must have that. Well, Sweden cannot do it alone. We are receiving by far more people per capita than any other nation, anywhere, except those in the local area. But in Europe, yes, and United States, not to speak about. We are much, much better in that sense.
Excuse me, question here.
Thank you. I was wondering if you would comment a little bit about your mother. You said in the beginning that you were going to talk about her a little bit, and you didn't. So I was just curious, how did your parents reconnect after the war? And can you talk a little bit about your mother and how she influenced this story and also your childhood growing up?
Oh, thanks for giving me the opportunity, and sorry that I... Yes, there is a wonderful love story in this book, and it's about my father and my mother who met as teenage lovers in the ghetto. They just happened to live in the same block. They were very young, as you can understand, and then they were separated. I think I said that. And then they had promised, I guess, each other, as my mother tells me, that we'd go looking for each other for a certain time if they survived. And there is a moment in the book where my father, this is documented, he is then at a camp in northern Sweden or mid-northern Sweden, and he received this postcard from Germany saying that this and this Mrs. Stav, was my family name, my mother, can be reached at, and there's a terrible address with all just cell and numbers and so forth and so on, committee. And there is, in the book, and I quote quite extensively, the letter that my father writes to her, finding out that she's alive. It's even hard to, I still hard to talk about it. It was so moving, and it still is. It still is very, very, and then, my mother, people want me, that's the question I get all the time. So what about your mother? Why didn't you write about your mother? My mother is in the book, but I think most people want to know, how the hell did she go on after this? How did she make it? She passed away this April. That's the reason why I didn't come. And I guess this is a story. It's a story of a very strong woman, or a woman decided to do anything for her children. Those was me and my sister, and she did well. But that's not the book I'm going to write, I think. I don't think I'm able to. She was too close. I mean, the thing with my father was so good that he was away. So it gives a writer a certain license, in a way, I think, to write a story. And then if it's too close.
The next question's right here.
Thank you for your talk.
We're hearing about great waves of anti-Semitism sweeping through Europe, France, Britain, Sweden included, and we're seeing political actions against Israel and demonstrations and violent attacks. I'm curious about your views whether this migration of Arab refugees into Europe is aiding and abetting, as they are many of the perpetrators, and what you think may happen. Thank you.
Oh, what may happen, I don't know. It's a very volatile situation we are living in Europe today. All kinds of pressures, all kinds of fears, all kinds of resentments, all kinds of crackpot conspiracy theories. Israel-Palestine conflict, of course, goes into this, and anything else. Yes, there is anti-Semitism. Yes, there is a more vociferous anti-Semitism than we have been than we have experienced clearly. I would still say, having said all this, that we shouldn't. There is a lot of fear mongering too going on. We shouldn't. There is a bad dynamic that we should avoid here, and Jews in Europe are still living under conditions that are incomparably better than anything else ever before. We live in states, with some exceptions in Europe. I would say Hungary is bordering on something more sinister. But we live in states with the government, with political system that offer seriously and wish to offer full protection, not only to Jews, but to their minorities. We have other minority, much larger minorities in Sweden who also suffer a lot of, or feel that they are victimized in many ways. Anti-Semitism is special, I know that. So my only response is yes, there are problems. Anti-Semitism will never go away, by the way. Don't think that. It's there. It's too useful to not be there, and too much entrenched in European history and also in other. So it can easily be exploited. But I think it behooves Jews not to fall victim to fear-mongering. We shouldn't be afraid. Fear is the worst thing. I think we should live like Jews and also see the good thing about being Jews in Europe. I think there are many good things about it. And I'm doing my best my position in the Swedish public debate is to try to talk about what Judaism or what Jews or the things that actually are things that contribute. And I might lose this battle because people are afraid. This is the problem.
Question right here.
You mentioned very little of the press, that there was very little written about the camps and the people, the refugees. How many newspapers were there in Sweden when you were there first, and why do you think they had no interest in covering the refugees?
Well, I don't know. This is before I was born. It was 1945. But I have, go into archives, and I know where these camps were. There were many of them, small temporary barracks. And I was looking in the local newspaper to see if there was a story about it, and there were very little. That's all I can say. They were not, I don't know. It's hard to explain. They were not curious, or they were afraid of what they were about to hear or see. It's a little mystery. I don't think it was it was not because they had any resentment. I think it was just something so new and unusual, and the press at that time was a bit more traditional, more, what can I say? They reported the same news every day, and they basically reported the news that people already knew, which is classical. People want to read what they already know, especially if there is someone they know by name. I'm talking about local newspapers.
We have a last question right here.
Actually, I don't have a question so much as a remark I want to make. I grew up in post-war Europe in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands really suffered also very much from the Germans.
Yes.
And I later realized as I got older, how much the people in Europe were traumatized. I grew up with nothing but traumatized adults. And I know that the Jewish people I came to know later on, I'm not being Jewish myself, I know that the Jewish people I came to know as very close friends, that they had had a much more difficult time. But nevertheless, people did not, my own mother did not want to talk about the war a lot of time because they had been suffering so much and because it just reminded them of a very difficult time, and they wanted to think about other things. They didn't want to be reminded constantly of how bad things had been. And when you're talking about this, I get very, very emotional about this, but I get reminded of that again. And I didn't used to realize this when I was much younger, okay? But as I got older, I realized that most of Northern Europe and most of Southern Europe even had been very, very, very traumatized, and nobody was like normal, and people could not talk about this because it was all locked up inside of them, and they wanted to move on. Excuse me for being so emotional.
May I say something too? Thank you so much. No, I think what you do actually now point out, which is, I think it's one of the most important thing I would really like to say. I mean, we have made a Holocaust, I say, but it has been made into a sort of a Jewish story. It is a Jewish story. There is a part of the Holocaust that is definitely a Jewish story. But this is a human story. This is what humanity was able to get itself into, was the Nazi Germany and the consequences of it, in a way that I don't think in our kind of society we could have imagined people coming to that point, doing things of that kind to people whom they knew. So I think remembering the Holocaust or keeping it in memory is to keep it, to try to keep it a memory, a human memory, a memory for humankind. And I have seen, and I don't like that, a tendency to make it only an issue for the victims, the Jews. It's an issue for the perpetrators, for the bystanders, for everyone that was involved in this, and in the societies in which that took place, and which were not very different from our society today. And that, I think, is very important to keep in mind. Thank you.
I want to remind you that Goran Rosenberg will be signing books. Please join us in the atrium. Such a moving evening. Thank you to Barbara Osher for bringing Mr. Rosenberg here. Thank you, Göran Rosenberg, so much. Good night.